My son-in-law, Adrian Mercer, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Sir, employees use the front entrance. Visitors wait downstairs." The people standing around us went completely silent. Not one person corrected him. Not one person warned him who he was talking to. I simply nodded, thanked him, and walked away. I could have ended his career with a single sentence, but something about that silence stopped me. A minute later, my phone vibrated. It was the company's CEO, Nathaniel Cross. His message read, "Please don't tell him who you are. Not yet." I looked back through the lobby doors and watched Adrian smiling like he'd just put an old man in his place. He had no idea he worked for the one person who could change his entire future before the week was over. Before I tell you what happened after that message, if you've ever seen someone mistake kindness for weakness, take a second to subscribe. These stories remind us that respect is earned long before power is revealed. Now, let me show you why I chose to stay silent that day. Before I tell you what happened inside that building, you deserve to know who I am. My name is Gregory Holloway. I'm 63 years old, and for the first time in decades, my mornings usually begin with a cup of black coffee on my back porch instead of a stack of boardroom reports. Most people who meet me now assume I spent my life working an ordinary job before settling into retirement. I never bother correcting them. I've learned that the less people know about your success, the more honestly they reveal their own character. 40 years earlier, I started Holloway Industrial Systems in a rented warehouse with 6 employees, borrowed equipment, and more determination than money. Those early years demanded everything I had, but they also taught me something I'd never forgotten. A company's greatest asset isn't its machines or its contracts. It's the people who show up every morning, believing their hard work matters. That belief became the foundation of everything we built, and I promised myself that no matter how large the company became, nobody would ever be treated like they were insignificant. When my wife passed away, something inside me changed. The board encouraged me to remain the public face of the company, but I couldn't imagine spending every day inside conference rooms while the rest of my life felt painfully quiet. So I stepped away from daily operations and appointed Nathaniel Cross as CEO. Nathaniel had earned my confidence over nearly 20 years, and I knew the company was in capable hands. I remained the chairman and majority owner, but very few employees knew that anymore. I preferred it that way because titles often influence behavior far more than integrity ever should. My daughter, Evelyn Holloway Mercer, was relieved to see me slowing down. She'd spent years telling me there was more to life than quarterly reports and expansion plans, and maybe she was right. When she introduced me to Adrian Mercer, I genuinely wanted to like him. He was intelligent, confident, and willing to work harder than most people his age. I respected that. In fact, I quietly told Nathaniel that Adrian deserved every opportunity he earned. At the time, I believed ambition would make him a valuable leader. I never imagined it would slowly become the very thing that changed him. The first signs of trouble didn't come from my family. They came from strangers whose names meant nothing to me at the time. Over several months, confidential letters and anonymous emails began arriving at my private office instead of the executive floor. None of them accused Adrian of crimes or financial misconduct. Instead, they described something that disturbed me even more. Employees spoke about public humiliation, constant intimidation, and a workplace where people measured every word because they feared becoming someone's next example. The stories came from different departments, different positions, and different people who had never met each other, yet every one of them pointed toward the same executive. I could have asked Nathaniel to investigate from his office, but that wouldn't have answered the question I couldn't stop asking myself. Had my company really changed that much, or had one man simply become too comfortable, believing nobody above him was paying attention? The following Monday, I drove to our headquarters in Brentwood without a driver, without a tailored suit, and without anyone announcing I was coming. I parked near the back of the lot, grabbed an old leather folder, and walked toward the main entrance like any other visitor. Only Nathaniel Cross knew I would be there. and we'd agreed he wouldn't come downstairs or acknowledge me unless it became absolutely necessary. If I wanted to know what kind of culture still existed inside my company, I couldn't arrive looking like the man who owned it. The lobby looked exactly the way I remembered it. The reception desk had been remodeled. The company logo was larger than before, and photographs celebrating our biggest projects lined the walls. For a brief moment, I felt proud of everything we'd built together. Then the elevator doors opened, and Adrian Mercer stepped into the lobby surrounded by 2 department managers. He wasn't laughing or raising his voice. He simply carried himself like someone who expected every room to adjust the moment he entered it. People moved aside without being asked. Conversations stopped halfway through, and even the receptionist straightened her posture the second she noticed him. Adrian looked at me for only a few seconds before deciding exactly who he thought I was. His eyes drifted over my faded jacket, my worn boots, and the folder tucked beneath my arm. With a polite smile that never reached his eyes, he told me visitors weren't allowed to wander around the executive floor and suggested I wait downstairs until someone came to collect me. The words themselves weren't insulting. It was the way he said them, as though I had already been measured and dismissed before speaking a single sentence. What caught my attention wasn't Adrian, it was everyone else's reaction. Several employees recognized that something wasn't right, yet not one of them dared interrupt him. I thanked him, turned around, and walked away exactly as he'd instructed. Behind me, I heard him continue his conversation as though nothing unusual had happened. I could have introduced myself right there. One sentence would have changed the entire atmosphere inside that lobby. But I wasn't interested in embarrassing my son-in-law. I was interested in discovering why dozens of capable employees had chosen silence over honesty. As I stepped outside, my phone vibrated. The message was from Nathaniel Cross. It contained only 7 words. "Please don't reveal yourself. Not yet." I stared at the screen for a moment, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and realized this visit was about to uncover far more than one man's arrogance. I spent the rest of that morning doing something I hadn't done in years. Instead of sitting in a conference room listening to presentations, I walked the halls. I stopped near workstations, visited departments that rarely saw senior leadership, and struck up simple conversations whenever the opportunity felt natural. Most employees assumed I was an outside consultant or a retired executive invited in for a tour. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. People tend to speak more honestly when they believe their words won't travel any farther than the person standing in front of them. The first few conversations were harmless. People talked about production deadlines, new equipment, and the challenges of keeping up with growing demand. But whenever Adrian's name surfaced, something changed. Voices became quieter. Eyes drifted toward nearby offices before another sentence was spoken. One supervisor laughed nervously and said, "He's just demanding," before immediately changing the subject. Another employee started answering my question, then stopped halfway through and apologized as though she'd almost broken an unwritten rule. I wasn't hearing confidence. I was hearing caution, and there was a very important difference between the two. Late that morning, I stepped into the manufacturing campus, where I'd spent most of my own career before moving into executive leadership. That's where Victor Salinas, our senior maintenance supervisor, quietly recognized me. His eyes widened for a split second before he walked over and shook my hand like we were old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. He never addressed me as chairman or Mr. Holloway. He understood exactly why I was there. As we walked through the facility together, he spoke carefully, choosing every word with the kind of restraint that only comes from someone who spent months holding back. "People still love this company," he said softly. "They just don't feel safe speaking inside it anymore." Before I could ask what he meant, raised voices echoed from the engineering department. We both turned instinctively. Through the glass conference room wall, I saw Adrian standing at the front of the room while a young engineer tried to explain a production concern. The engineer wasn't arguing. He was respectfully pointing out a flaw that could delay an important shipment. Adrian listened with folded arms, smiled as though he appreciated the feedback, and then calmly dismantled the man's credibility in front of everyone. He questioned his experience, mocked his judgment, and finished by asking whether anyone else wanted to waste everyone's time with imaginary problems. No one answered. The engineer slowly sat down, and the meeting moved on, as if nothing had happened. Victor didn't say another word after that. He didn't have to. Everything I needed to know was written across the faces of the people leaving that room. They weren't angry. They weren't surprised. They looked like people who had watched the same scene play out so many times that they'd stopped expecting anyone to stop it. At that moment, I realized the anonymous letters hadn't exaggerated a single detail. If anything, they'd been too gentle. My son-in-law hadn't built a culture of excellence. He'd built a culture where silence had become the safest way to survive. And for the first time since walking into my own company, I stopped wondering whether the complaints were true and started wondering just how much damage Adrian had managed to hide from the rest of us. That evening, long after most employees had gone home, I took a private elevator to the chairman's office. The room hadn't changed much since the days I used it every morning. The same walnut desk overlooked the production campus where I'd spent half my life solving problems alongside people who believed in the company as much as I did. A few minutes later, Nathaniel Cross walked in carrying 2 thick folders instead of 1. He didn't waste time with greetings. He quietly placed them on the desk and said, "I think you're about to understand why I asked you not to reveal yourself." The first folder contained resignation letters. Not 1 or 2, but dozens collected over the past 18 months. As I read through them, I noticed something unsettling. Very few employees complained about the workload or the business itself. They spoke about losing confidence, losing motivation, and eventually losing respect for leaders who allowed bad behavior to continue unchecked. Different names appeared on every page, yet the same sentence seemed to echo throughout every letter. People weren't leaving because they hated their jobs. They were leaving because they no longer believed their voices mattered. That's a far more dangerous problem than declining profits. Money can be recovered. Trust rarely returns once it's been broken. Nathaniel opened the second folder and slid several internal reports toward me. Felicia Rowan, our Vice President of Human Resources, had quietly documented repeated complaints that never became formal investigations because employees withdrew them before the process even began. According to follow-up interviews, they all gave nearly identical reasons. They feared retaliation. Some believed promotions would disappear. Others worried their teams would be punished for speaking up. Reading those reports, I wasn't looking at isolated conflicts anymore. I was looking at a pattern that had spread through the company one decision at a time, until fear had become part of the culture itself. Then Nathaniel pressed a button on his laptop and turned the screen toward me. A routine compliance recording from the previous week began playing. Adrian stood confidently at the front of a management meeting, speaking with the kind of certainty that only comes from believing nobody will ever challenge you. Then he smiled and said, "Around here, the CEO's word is final, and I'm the closest person you'll ever get to that office. If you want opportunities, make sure you're standing on the right side of me." The room fell silent after those words, but nobody questioned him. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, trying to reconcile that voice with the man my daughter had married. Finally, I looked at Nathaniel and gave him a single instruction. "Don't change next week's executive leadership meeting," I said quietly. "Let Adrian believe it's going to be another ordinary Monday." Nathaniel studied my face for a moment before nodding. Neither of us said another word, because we both understood something Adrian didn't. His biggest mistake wasn't disrespecting me in the lobby. His biggest mistake was believing no one was ever going to hold him accountable. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was deciding what to do about Adrian, but because I couldn't stop thinking about my daughter. Evelyn Holloway Mercer had no idea what I'd discovered inside the company, and I found myself wondering how much of the man I'd just uncovered she had ever seen at home. It would have been easy to call her, lay every report on the table, and let the truth speak for itself. But if I did that, she'd hear the story through my anger instead of her own judgment. She deserved better than that. The following evening, Evelyn invited me over for dinner. Adrian was still at the office, so it was just the two of us sitting in her kitchen, talking about ordinary things. She asked how retirement was treating me, whether I was finally learning to relax, and laughed when I admitted I still woke up before sunrise out of habit. Watching her smile reminded me of the little girl who used to wait by the front window every evening just to see my truck pull into the driveway. The last thing I wanted was to become the reason that smile disappeared. As we cleared the dishes, Evelyn mentioned that Adrian had been working incredibly hard lately and said she hoped another promotion was coming soon. There wasn't pride in her voice as much as hope. She genuinely believed everything he was doing was for their future together. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked her one question that seemed simple enough on the surface. If success ever changed someone you loved, how long do you think it would take before you noticed? She looked at me with a puzzled expression, smiled uncertainly, and said she didn't think ambition could change a person's heart. I wanted to believe she was right. Instead, I quietly nodded and changed the subject. As I drove home later that night, I realized the board meeting was no longer just about protecting the company. Whatever happened inside that room would almost certainly change my daughter's life as well. For the first time since this began, the hardest decision in front of me wasn't whether Adrian deserved to face the consequences of his actions. It was whether Evelyn was truly prepared to discover the man she'd been standing beside all these years. Monday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm. By 8 o'clock, every member of the executive leadership team had taken their seat inside the board auditorium. The quarterly leadership meeting was one of the few events Adrian never missed because it gave him an audience. From where I was watching through the one-way glass connected to the chairman's office, I could see him greeting executives with effortless confidence. He looked relaxed, shook hands, cracked a few jokes, and carried himself like a man who believed another successful quarter was about to strengthen his reputation even further. When the meeting officially began, Adrian stood to deliver his presentation. Slide after slide praised record production numbers, improved efficiency, and stronger departmental performance. Listening carefully, I noticed something familiar. Every success belonged to Adrian. Every challenge belonged to someone else. Whenever another executive's contribution appeared on the screen, he mentioned it briefly before steering the conversation back toward his own leadership. Around the table, several people exchanged quiet glances, but nobody interrupted him. They were waiting, just as I was. After nearly 20 minutes, Adrian smiled confidently and closed his presentation. If we continue at this pace, he said, I believe we'll be discussing another expansion before the end of the year. The room remained completely silent. There was no applause, no congratulations, no questions. Adrian looked around, expecting the usual response, but instead found 12 expressionless faces staring back at him. For the first time since I'd walked into that lobby, I saw uncertainty cross his face. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Deep down, he knew something wasn't unfolding the way he'd expected. Then the conference room doors opened behind him. Nathaniel slowly stood from his chair and calmly addressed the room. Before we move on, he said, there's one person who hasn't had the opportunity to speak yet. Adrian turned toward the doorway with a polite smile, probably expecting another board member or outside consultant. He had absolutely no reason to believe the quiet old man he'd dismissed a few days earlier was about to walk into the room and change every certainty he'd built his career upon. The room stayed silent as I walked through the doorway. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Every member of the board slowly rose from their seat, one after another, until the entire room was standing. Adrian looked from one face to the next, clearly confused by what he was seeing. Then his eyes settled on me. For a brief second, I caught the same polite smile he'd worn in the lobby a few days earlier, as though he still believed I was simply another guest invited to observe the meeting. That smile disappeared the moment Nathaniel Cross stepped away from the head of the table and welcomed me with the words, "Good morning, Mr. Chairman." Adrian frowned, waiting for someone to laugh or explain the misunderstanding. No one did. Nathaniel calmly continued, "For those of you who joined the company in recent years, I'd like to formally introduce Gregory Holloway, founder, chairman, and majority owner of Holloway Industrial Systems." The words seemed to drain every ounce of confidence from Adrian's face. He looked at me, then back at Nathaniel, then around the room again, searching for anything that suggested this was some elaborate joke. Instead, he found executives avoiding his eyes. In that moment, I don't think he was worried about losing his position. I think he was trying to understand how the quiet old man he'd dismissed in the lobby had suddenly become the most powerful person in the building. I invited everyone to sit before taking the chair at the end of the table. "This meeting isn't about quarterly results," I said calmly. "It's about leadership." I nodded toward Nathaniel, who began distributing identical folders to every board member, including Adrian. Inside were employee statements, resignation letters, compliance reports, and documented complaints collected over the past 18 months. No opinions, no rumors, just facts. Adrian flipped through the pages faster and faster, occasionally stopping as he recognized his own emails, meeting notes, and decisions staring back at him in black and white. Every attempt to dismiss one document only led directly to another. When Nathaniel played the compliance recording, the room became impossibly quiet. Adrian heard his own voice fill the speakers. "The CEO's word is final, and I'm the closest person you'll ever get to that office." Nobody interrupted the recording. Nobody rushed to explain it away. They simply let his own words remain in the room long after the audio had ended. Adrian finally tried to speak, insisting his comments had been taken out of context, that he was only motivating his managers, that people had misunderstood his intentions. But every explanation collapsed beneath another piece of evidence waiting inside the folder. For the first time since entering the meeting, he realized this wasn't an accusation. It was an accounting. I looked directly at Adrian, not with anger, but with genuine disappointment. "The day we met in the lobby," I said quietly, "you believed my jacket, my truck, and my age told you everything you needed to know about me. The truth is, I never cared that you failed to recognize me. I cared that you treated someone you believed had no authority as though they deserved less respect." I paused just long enough for those words to settle over the room. Leadership isn't measured by how you speak to the people who can help your career. It's measured by how you treat the people you think can do nothing for you. Adrian lowered his eyes to the table. For the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing left to say. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Adrian kept staring at the documents in front of him, as though reading them again might somehow change what they said. Then, slowly, he pushed back his chair and looked directly at me. Gone was the confidence he'd carried into the room only half an hour earlier. "Mr. Holloway," he began quietly, his voice unsteady for the first time. "I made mistakes. I let my position get the better of me. But I can fix this. Just give me one chance to make things right." Around the table, no one reacted. They'd heard promises before. What mattered now was whether those promises had come too late. I let the silence linger before answering. "Adrian, this meeting was never about one mistake." I folded my hands on the table and held his gaze. "Every leader makes mistakes. Good leaders admit them, learn from them, and protect the people they lead. What you've done is something entirely different. You built an environment where honest employees became afraid to speak. Talented people walked away instead of being heard. And fear slowly replaced trust. None of that happened overnight, and none of it happened by accident." His shoulders dropped a little further with every sentence because, deep down, he knew I wasn't describing one bad week. I was describing the leader he'd chosen to become. Nathaniel quietly slid one final document across the table. It was Adrian's termination notice, already approved by the board. Effective immediately, his executive authority, company access, and leadership responsibilities were revoked. Dominic Ashford, our chief legal officer, calmly explained the post-employment restrictions and the internal review that would continue over the coming weeks. There was no shouting, no humiliation, and no celebration. Justice didn't need an audience. The facts had already spoken more loudly than any of us ever could. As Adrian gathered the few personal belongings he'd brought into the meeting, he stopped beside my chair. His voice had almost disappeared. "If I'd known who you were," he whispered. I looked up at him and gently shook my head. "That's exactly the problem," I replied. "You shouldn't have needed to know." He stood there for a moment, searching for another answer that never came. Then he quietly walked toward the boardroom doors, leaving behind the title he'd spent years protecting. I watched them close behind him and realized the company hadn't just removed the wrong executive that morning. It had finally given its employees something they'd been waiting far too long to see. Proof that respect still mattered more than power. News travels quickly inside a company, but respect travels even faster. By the end of that afternoon, employees still didn't know every detail of what had happened inside the boardroom. They only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone had finally listened. Over the next few weeks, people who had once stayed silent began speaking openly again. Department managers started challenging ideas without fearing retaliation. Experienced employees withdrew their resignation plans, and the atmosphere inside the building slowly began to feel familiar again. It wasn't because one executive had been removed. It was because everyone finally believed the rules applied to every person in the company, regardless of title. Walking through the production floor one last time, I saw something I'd been hoping for since the day I arrived. People weren't looking over their shoulders anymore. They were simply getting back to work. Looking back now, I rarely think about the morning my son-in-law failed to recognize me. What stays with me is something far more important. Power never reveals a person's character. It only magnifies what was already there. And if there's one lesson I carried away from all of this, it's that the people you believe have nothing to offer you are often the ones who reveal exactly who you really are.